Did medieval people have dentists? The short answer is no, not in any way we would recognize. There was no clean office, no friendly hygienist, no x-rays or anesthetic. If you had a problem with your teeth during the Middle Ages, you were in for a world of pain. Your options were limited and all of them were bad. To understand medieval dentistry, you have to first understand medieval teeth. And they were often a mess. We have this idea that because they didn't have refined sugar, their teeth must have been perfect. That's not quite right. While they didn't have candy bars and soda, their diets presented their own set of problems. The foundation of most people's diet, especially the poor, was bread. Coarse, dark bread made from grains like rye and barley. This grain was ground with stone millstones, and tiny abrasive bits of that stone ended up in the flour. Every single loaf of bread was filled with grit, so with every meal, people were slowly but surely grinding down their teeth. They were wearing away the hard, protective enamel. Once that enamel was gone, the softer dentin underneath was exposed. This led to sensitivity, decay, and eventually, the death of the tooth. Rich people had a different problem. They could afford finer, less gritty bread, but they could also afford sugar, which was an expensive luxury imported from the East. They used it in their food, and they used honey as a sweetener. This, of course, led to cavities, just like it does today. So, the poor wore their teeth down to stumps, and the rich rotted theirs with sugar. Different paths, same painful destination, and the problems didn't stop there. A cracked tooth or a deep cavity was an open door for infection. The bacteria could get into the pulp, the soft center of the tooth, and cause an abscess. This is a pocket of pus that forms at the root of the tooth. The pain would have been excruciating. A throbbing, relentless agony that made it impossible to eat, sleep, or think. Your face would swell up. You'd get a fever. Without antibiotics, this infection could spread. It could go into the jawbone, causing it to rot away. It could get into the bloodstream, a condition we now call sepsis. An infected tooth wasn't just a nuisance, it was a life-threatening medical emergency. A simple toothache could kill you, and it often did. So people lived with a level of dental pain that is hard for us to imagine. They would have chronic, low-grade toothaches, they would have sudden, sharp pains when chewing, they would have swollen gums and foul breath. Missing teeth were completely normal. Most skulls from the period show evidence of severe dental disease. People expected to lose their teeth as they got older. It was just a part of life. But when the pain became unbearable, when the abscess was so large you couldn't close your mouth, you had to do something. You couldn't just live with it anymore. You had to seek help. The problem was, the people who offered that help were often just as dangerous as the infection itself. They were not dentists. They were a motley crew of tradesmen, healers, and showmen who practiced a brutal, terrifying craft. When a medieval person needed a tooth pulled, they didn't book an appointment with a specialist. There was no such thing. Instead, they had to find someone in their community who was willing to do the job. And the people who did this work came from all walks of life. The most common practitioner was the barber-surgeon. In the Middle Ages, the jobs of cutting hair and performing surgery were linked. Your local barber was the man you went to for a shave, a haircut, and a bloodletting. He was also the guy who would pull your tooth. Barber-surgeons were craftsmen, not educated doctors. They learned their trade through apprenticeship, not by going to a university. Their shops would have been a common sight in any town. They were often marked by a red and white striped pole, which symbolized blood and bandages. Inside, it would have been a chaotic place. People getting their hair cut next to someone getting a wound stitched. The tools of the trade would be laid out: razors, scissors, lancets for bleeding, and of course the fearsome iron tongs and keys for pulling teeth. There was no concept of sterilization. The same tool might be used on a dozen people without being washed. The barber surgeon was a man of strong arms and a stronger stomach. He didn't need to know anatomy. He just needed to be able to yank hard enough. For a time in the early Middle Ages, monks were some of the most skilled medical practitioners. Monasteries were centers of learning. Monks could read Latin and Greek, so they had access to ancient medical texts from authors like Galen. They cultivated herb gardens and knew about poultices and remedies. They understood more about the body than most. But in 1163, the Pope issued an edict. The Church declared that monks and priests were forbidden from performing any procedure that involved cutting or the shedding of blood. It was considered work that dirtied the soul. So the practice of surgery, including dentistry, was pushed out of the monasteries and into the hands of tradesmen like the barbers. What about university-trained physicians? They did exist, but they wouldn't have dreamed of pulling a tooth. They saw themselves as intellectuals, not laborers. A physician would diagnose an illness based on the theory of the four humors. He would examine your urine, check your pulse, and consult astrological charts. He might determine that your toothache was caused by an imbalance of phlegm in your head. He might then prescribe a diet or a purge, but he would never touch the tooth itself. That was dirty, manual work, far beneath him. A wealthy patient might hire a physician to oversee a tooth extraction, but the physician would just stand there and direct the barber surgeon who did the actual bloody work. In villages without a barber, people had other options. They might go to a local wise woman or a folk healer. These people relied on herbal remedies and traditional knowledge. They might give you a poultice of herbs to put on your cheek to reduce swelling. Or they might have you recite a charm or prayer to drive the pain away. They usually didn't pull teeth, but they offered a way to manage the pain. Then there were the tooth drawers. These were often traveling showmen who would set up a stall at a market or fair. They were part entertainer, part con man. To attract a crowd, they would have a loud drummer or a trumpeter. The music served two purposes. It drew people in, and it helped drown out the screams of the patient. The tooth drawer would put on a big show, boasting of his skill and his painless methods. He would often have a necklace of teeth he had pulled to prove his experience. His methods were fast, brutal, and public. Once he had his patient in the chair, he would work quickly, pull the tooth, and hold it up for the crowd to see. Then he would probably try to sell the audience a useless potion to prevent toothaches. And if all else failed, if you were in a remote village in the dead of winter and a tooth was killing you, there was one last resort, the blacksmith. He had a forge, a strong arm, and a variety of pliers and tongs. It was the most brutal option imaginable, but sometimes it was the only one. A blacksmith knew nothing of medicine, but he knew how to grip and pull. It was a desperate act for a desperate person. The actual process of medieval dental treatment was a brutal affair. It was defined by three things: pain, crude tools, and a complete lack of hygiene. There was no escape from the agony. First, let's talk about anesthesia. There wasn't any, not really. The most a person could hope for was a lot of alcohol. You could drink yourself into a stupor with strong ale or wine, but you would still be conscious. You would still feel everything. Some medical texts mentioned sedatives made from plants like mandrake, henbane, or opium poppies. But these were extremely dangerous. The line between a dose that would dull the pain and a dose that would kill you was very thin. Most practitioners wouldn't risk it, so the standard procedure involved no painkillers at all. The patient was simply held down. A strong assistant, or a few of them, would restrain the person's arms, legs, and head while the barber-surgeon went to work. The tools they used were terrifying. The most basic was a simple pair of forceps, which looked like a blacksmith's pliers. The idea was to grip the crown of the tooth and rock it back and forth to loosen it from the ligaments, then pull it straight out. But this rarely worked so smoothly. If the tooth was badly decayed, the crown would just crumble under the pressure of the forceps. The barber surgeon would then be left to dig out the broken roots one by one with sharp picks. If a tooth was stubborn, they brought out a more fearsome tool, the dental pelican. It was named that because its claw and bolster mechanism looked something like a pelican's beak. It was not designed to pull the tooth up, but to lever it out sideways. The practitioner would place the claw over the top of the tooth and the bolster, a half-moon-shaped piece of metal, on the gum next to it. Then he would use the handle to apply leverage. The force was immense. The pelican would rip the tooth out of its socket, often taking a large chunk of gum tissue and jawbone with it. It was effective, but incredibly destructive. An even worse invention was the dental key. This came into use later in the period, but was just as brutal. It was a metal rod with a handle on one end and a claw on the other. It looked like an old-fashioned door key. The claw was hooked over the tooth, and the shaft of the key was rested against the root. Then the practitioner would turn the handle, like turning a key in a lock. This twisting motion would, in theory, pop the tooth out of its socket. The problem was that the force was almost impossible to control. The key very often slipped, breaking the teeth next to it. Or worse, the force would be so great that it would shatter the patient's jaw. Imagine the scene. You are in a crowded, dirty marketplace. Your head is being held steady, your mouth forced open. A man with dirty hands is coming at you with a piece of iron. The crowd is watching. There is no anesthetic. He jams the tool into your mouth, trying to get a grip on the rotten tooth. You feel the cold metal against your gums. Then comes the pressure, the twisting, the pulling. The sound of your own tooth cracking, the feeling of the root tearing away from the bone. The pain would have been a white-hot, blinding flash, and the screaming would have been drowned out by a drum. After the tooth was out, the ordeal wasn't over. You were left with a gaping, bleeding wound in your mouth. There were no stitches. The best a barber surgeon could offer was to cauterize the wound. He would take a metal rod, heat it in a fire until it was red hot, and then press it into the empty socket. The idea was to stop the bleeding and purify the wound by burning it. The smell of your own flesh searing would have been sickening. And all of this was done with no understanding of germs. The tools were not sterile. The practitioner's hands were not clean. The risk of postoperative infection was huge. Many people survived the brutal extraction, only to die a week later from an infection that started in their jaw. It was a gamble. You were trading the definite agony of a toothache for the possible, and even probable, agony of a fatal infection. To us, the cause of a toothache is simple decay caused by bacteria, but in the Middle Ages they had no concept of microscopic germs. Their understanding of disease was based on a combination of ancient theories, religious beliefs, and folklore. To understand their dentistry, you have to understand why they thought teeth went bad in the first place. The most popular and widespread belief was the theory of the toothworm. This idea was ancient, dating back to the Babylonians, and it persisted for thousands of years. People genuinely believed that a toothache was caused by a tiny worm that had burrowed into the tooth. They thought this worm would wriggle around inside, gnawing on the nerves and causing the terrible pain. The hole in the tooth wasn't decay, it was the tunnel the worm had drilled. This belief shaped many of their treatments. If a worm was the cause, then the cure was to get the worm out. One common practice was fumigation. The practitioner would heat a mixture of seeds, often henbane, on a piece of charcoal. The patient would then inhale the smoke through a funnel directed at the painful tooth. After a few minutes of this, they would spit into a bowl of water. In the bowl, they would often see little white things that looked like worms. The patient and practitioner would believe these were the worms that had been smoked out of the tooth. In reality, they were likely the embryos from inside the henbane seeds, which look remarkably like tiny maggots. But for the suffering patient, it was proof that the cure had worked. Another approach was to try and kill the worm with various substances. People would pack the cavity with all sorts of things they thought would be poisonous or unpleasant for a worm. Mixtures of honey, spiders' webs, and earwax were common. They might use caustic substances like arsenic paste. This would certainly kill the nerve of the tooth and thus stop the pain, but it would also kill the surrounding gum tissue and bone, leading to even worse problems later on. Alongside the toothworm theory was the official medical doctrine of the time, the theory of the four humors. This was the system developed by the ancient Greeks, particularly Galen, and it was the foundation of all university medical training. The theory held that the human body was made of four basic substances, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these four humors in perfect balance. All illness from a cold to a cancer was caused by an imbalance. A physician would diagnose a toothache within this framework. He might decide that the patient had an excess of phlegm, a cold and wet humor, that had settled in the head and was now dripping down and rotting the teeth. The treatment would be to restore balance. This could involve prescribing a hot and dry diet to counteract the phlegm. Or it could involve bleeding the patient to remove excess humors from the body. It was a very systematic, logical framework. It just happened to be completely wrong. This is why physicians rarely treated the tooth itself. The tooth was just a symptom of a systemic imbalance. The real problem was with the humors. Finally, religion and superstition played a huge role. For many, a toothache was a test from God or a punishment for a sin. The first response was not to see a barber, but to pray. People would pray to specific saints for intercession. The patron saint of toothache sufferers was Saint Apollonia. She was a martyr from the 3rd century who, during her persecution, had all of her teeth violently pulled out or shattered. Because of her suffering, people believed she had a special sympathy for those with dental pain. They would pray to her, light candles in her name, and visit her shrines in hopes of a miracle cure. There were also countless folk remedies and charms. A person might be told to touch a dead person's tooth to cure their own pain, or to drive a nail into a tree while reciting an incantation, or to wear a specific amulet around their neck. These practices seem strange to us, but for a person in constant pain with no good medical options, they offered a sliver of hope. They were trying anything and everything to stop the agony. While the brutal extraction of a tooth was the most common form of dental surgery, it wasn't the only thing medieval people did for their teeth. They did have ideas about hygiene, prevention, and even cosmetics. These practices were a world away from the tooth drawer's bloody stall in the marketplace, but they show that people did care about their teeth and tried to look after them with the knowledge they had. Dental hygiene was a part of daily life, at least for those who could afford it. People didn't have toothbrushes, but they used other things to clean their teeth. A common method was to take a small twig from a certain type of tree, like hazel or oak, and chew on the end until the fibers separated, forming a crude brush. They would then use this to scrub their teeth. They also used pieces of rough linen cloth. They would dip the cloth in water or a cleaning solution and rub it vigorously against their teeth and gums. To help with the cleaning, they used tooth powders. These were homemade abrasive pastes. Common ingredients included crushed up chalk, brick dust, salt, or charcoal. For a more pleasant experience, they might add powdered herbs like mint, sage, or cloves, which helped to freshen the breath. The wealthy could afford more exotic and expensive ingredients like crushed coral, ground up bones, or even powdered pearls. Bad breath was a major social concern, just as it is today. People used mouthwashes to combat it. A simple mouthwash could be made with water and vinegar. A more complex one would involve boiling herbs and spices like cloves, cinnamon, and mint in wine. After a meal, a person would take a sip, swish it around their mouth, and spit it out. These mouthwashes didn't cure underlying problems like gum disease, but they did help to mask the odor for a while. When it came to fixing teeth, options were extremely limited. The concept of a filling did exist, but it was rare and rudimentary. Some practitioners would try to pack a cavity with a mixture of beeswax and ground herbs. This might provide temporary relief from sensitivity, but it wouldn't stop the decay. For the very rich, a dentist might use gold leaf, carefully packing tiny sheets of gold into the hole. This was purely cosmetic and incredibly expensive, a way to show off wealth. And what about replacing missing teeth? This was the ultimate luxury. False teeth, or dentures, did exist in the Middle Ages, but they were not like the ones we have today. They were purely cosmetic and were not functional for eating. They were for appearances only. These false teeth were carved from bone, usually from an ox or from ivory, such as hippopotamus or elephant tusk. They would be carved into the shape of the missing teeth and then tied into place. They were held in the mouth by being wired to the neighboring healthy teeth with threads of gold or silver. Sometimes they even used real human teeth. These were known as Waterloo teeth in a later period, but the practice existed earlier. The teeth would be taken from the dead on a battlefield or purchased from a poor person who was desperate enough to sell their own healthy teeth. These would then be mounted on a base and wired into the mouth of a wealthy client. It was a ghoulish practice, but it provided the most realistic-looking replacement. These dentures were uncomfortable. They were difficult to keep clean and would quickly become stained and foul-smelling. They were a status symbol, a way for a nobleman or a wealthy merchant to hide the gaps in their smile at court. But they would likely have been removed before a meal, so when we look at the full picture, we see a stark divide. For the vast majority of the population, dental care meant enduring pain until it became so unbearable that they submitted to a brutal, unhygienic, and terrifying extraction. But for the wealthy elite, a more delicate world of preventative care existed. They had access to powders, mouthwashes, and even crude cosmetic replacements. It was a far cry from modern dentistry. Their understanding of disease was wrong. Their surgical techniques were barbaric, but it wasn't a complete void. In their own way, medieval people worried about their teeth. They tried to clean them, they tried to ease their pain, they did the best they could in a world without science, without anesthesia, and without mercy for a simple toothache.